Hi, this is Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. This is going to be part 5 of my 10k scoop hand history review. We're a few hours in terms of game time, and since we're not actually that far behind in terms of series runtime, I'm just going to dive straight into the action. Smallish open with very bad queens. These are actually going to be quite close to a fold. They could even be a preflop fold, but it's going to be fringy. Probably open the queen high suit and maybe fold this particular combination. You do, like, if this were, as I've said in other content, but obviously I have no way of knowing which of my videos people viewing this one have seen, so from time to time I'll repeat myself, and my regular audience will just have to bear with me a little bit. There's a distinct difference between our inclination to VPIP King King XX and Queen Queen XX when the XX is pretty mediocre. We're typically going to play a lot more kings than queens, and then the progression becomes smoother. So it's not sort of slightly more queens than jacks, or slightly more jacks than tens, slightly more queens than jacks, slightly more king. It's like a lot more kings than queens, and then only a little bit more queens than jacks, only a little bit more jacks than tens, and so on and so forth. So King King seems to be the threshold where the hand's kind of strong enough to stand on its own 2 feet, and irrespective of how disconnected and redundant and appalling and whatever else the other 2 cards are, the hand just becomes plus EV. Whereas this combination could potentially be a fold. And since I've mentioned it at such length, I'm going to do a super quick checkup. Okay, so by way of illustration, I'm using the 50 big blind sim, folds around to us in the cutoff. We have kings, we're basically opening every single one apart from the trips combinations. Queens, we fold the bottom 25%, and then the progression smooths out. Roughly 10% difference between queens and tens, 10% difference between tens and jacks, and so on and so forth. So, queen, queen, 8 deuce is actually folding even with the queen high suit. So, my open's a little bit too loose. If I had king, king, 8 deuce, it would still be fine. So, yeah. Point sufficiently made, I think. Anyway, Linus defends in the big blind, and I probably just get to actually pure c-bet this board from cutoff. This combo is obviously completely atrocious, but when range advantage is as big as it is here, both in terms of equity and polarity, that kind of just ceases to matter. You know, like, if the board is good enough that you probably get to bet your entire range, then how bad your combination is ceases to have any relevance. It does make kind of an instinctive check, and check is the combination, is the option we went with. Turn is super standard check to this action. Like, we have the type of hand where he's never folding anything better or calling with much worse. And on the river, he goes with block. This is, again, pretty close. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the hand in part 4 that was also a check-down pot, although Linus was the imposition player in that instance. I'm not sure I have enough Ace-X, King-X to defend only those hands. And I also block his highest frequency Ace-X bet, which is a little bit of a thing. We went with fold here, and when I was looking at this the first time, it was just like very, very twice in relatively short order, I folded when highish in my range against smallish Linus river bet, which doesn't seem like a trend to establish and maintain. You know, I'd imagine I shouldn't be deviating from reasonable defense frequencies pretty much at all. I do get to fold some 2-pair combinations because I have just so much Ace-X, King-X preflop, and I have, like, my King-X isn't really diluted by prior action, because if I'm developing a flop checking range, then King X goes in it at some frequency, and obviously pure checks turn. So I show up with some reasonable amount of King X, but obviously combinatorically with 2 on board, I'm not going to have a whole bunch. And I'd imagine I call pretty linear with my, like, if we establish, or if we argue for the sake of this analysis that I do need to call some hands worse than Ace-X, which I think is probably likely versus block, then I want to call linearly because the higher pairs have a more restrictive effect on his value region. Or potentially put more simply, I'd say he's more likely to bet with ace-queen than ace-9. So I, in turn, should be more likely to call with queen-queen than 9-9 because I block more of his value bets. Like, if he has just ace-9, 5-4, I'd imagine that hand checks because he can't bet all his ace-x because otherwise he's vulnerable himself. And so betting, ace-queen or ace-jack plus, let's say, for this sizing, and then checking the weaker ace-x would in turn incline me to call my highest pairs and then fold some of the middling pocket pairs. So this seems slightly loose, or slightly tight, rather. And is another example, actually, as in the first video, of you need to be careful to find the right defense in situations where, like, it's very easy to just, I have a ton of better stuff, so I fold. But if you don't quantify the frequency with which you'll have better hands and kind of justify it using data, then you just end up folding too high in your range again and again and again. Check back flop seems pretty nice here. I would imagine I do quite well checking back this board quite frequently when I open under the gun. I don't have a massive polarity advantage. And also, I think weakish flush draws, like I have a backdoor flush draw and some straight draw turns I can barrel and so on and so forth. But when I open from under the gun, I just have a ton of stronger flush draws to bet. I have all the nut flush draws. I have all the king with flush draw, queen x with flush draw, that kind of thing. Just a higher concentration of suited hands in general. So checking mediocre draws seems pretty decent. And I can still defend against probes with this hand on quite a lot of turns. So yeah, check back seems good. Turn, obviously, I'm mostly going to be betting, but I don't hate checking if done occasionally. And when I see myself go with check, I mean, it occurs to me that cleaner is the type of opponent it can work well against because he's what Phil would call a high-intensity opponent, in that if he thinks you're weak or if he thinks you'll struggle to defend against a particular line, he'll put you to the test more than some other people who might be like, well, I don't think you have anything, but I don't have anything either. Cleaner is a lot more in the I don't think you have anything, so all my chips are flying into the pot and let's see what you do about it kind of thing. So yeah, I don't hate checking back the odd flush. The fact that I block the turned pair is a little bit of a thing, although not very much. I'll struggle not to block something or other with one card in my hand. But yeah, mostly bet, mix in a few checks. Like, neither option is exactly wrong. It's a matter of getting the correct frequencies. And by the river, I'm obviously betting. I think I'm meant to size down a little bit. Like, the bulk of my range is now probably the bluffs without nutted blockers, because the nutted blocker combinations bet an earlier street. Or thin value bets, like, I guess Queen 8. I mean, I struggle to find many thin value bets, because a lot of them are like Queen 7, Queen 4, which bet flop at a reasonable frequency. But if I decide to bet as low down in my range as like Queen 3, maybe even 8-7 if I'm going super thin, then those are hands that I will have checked back at a reasonable frequency. And then the other type of hand I'll bet is good flushes with bad removal effects. So like strong hands that I check back turn because I just crushed his continuing range too hard. It's worth noting that the fourth flush card probably makes me want to value bet a little bit thinner. Like, I can bet a little bit weaker with my two pair combinations on the 3 of diamonds than I could on the 3 of spades. So we go with like 40% pot and like not much smaller than this. Like, I definitely wouldn't want to go any lower, but anything around this or like the half pot region. And then challenge him to find the right calls, or challenge him to find enough calls with a range that's now checked 3 times seems pretty reasonable. He has obviously an auto call with this particular hand. I think this is going to be a 3-bet versus cutoff at like 30, just 35 big blinds, let's say. connected enough, like the pair's high enough. If it was like 10-8-7-7, then I'd be happy to just call, but 10-10 is just a bit too strong, I think. And I have 25 and 50 big blind preflop sims, so kind of betwixt and between. Looks like 10-10-8-7 gets in there at 50, so it'll obviously get in there at 35. It does seem to be the bottom of my 50 big blind 3-bet range, though, like 10-10-8-6 just calls. Or 10-10-7-6 just calls. So those hands probably get in there at slightly shallower stack sizes, but in the exact situation, 3-bet seems good. And super easy flop shove with enough equity. I can also fold him off some stuff like pocket queens, which is nice. Go with shove and get the fold. I think this is going to be a cold call even against under the gun open. It's like 2.25 or whatever X. So yeah, the small blind tends to get involved at a higher frequency in rake-free environments versus small opens. Ace-king with a nut suit is going to be strong enough to get involved, I think. The 9-8's a little bit kind of like, I have two card combinations not working together, but that's just going to be outweighed by the price I'm getting and my high card strength. And flop, I guess I can just check raise, get this in. But IP is going to be more polar as under the gun than button. Like, he's going to have less 8-6-5 hands that I'm actually either denying equity to or retaining equity against. Like, when he bets flop and I have this kind of hand, he's going to have either like more air balls or more hands that Ace King's doing quite poorly against. So with no backdoor flush draw, call's probably my preferred option. Check turn. I guess I could have led. That might have been a thing, but probably not for when I cold call versus under the gun. Linus goes with essentially shove. I improve on turn reasonably often. Like, I pure check call quite a bit of 8-7 on flop. I never fold ace-5 on the flop because I never fold ace-x on the flop. I sometimes check call flopped hands better than ace-king. So I'm not crazily high in my range, but I do check raise quite a bit of my better than ace-king on flop, and I do have worse ace-x that I can fold on the turn. So when I turn a gutter, I would assume with SPR like 1 and change, I'm probably meant to get this in. Like, I'm live-ish against something like, ace-queen 10-6. I'm not quite getting a sufficient price against that hand, but, he can have other stuff. He can have, 10-9, 8-6 with clubs, that kind of thing. I guess I kind of block that. I don't know, this seems kind of close. Instinctively, it seems like I might just about be meant to get this in with this SPR and then fold at like SPR 2 or something like that. We go with fold, but yeah. I'd probably prefer the alternative, but it's not going to be off by much. Cleaner min raises blind versus blind, which I can't say I massively care for. I'd prefer to have limps and then 3Xs. Definitely, if you have min raise, I think you shouldn't have limps. Otherwise, it's like, why even bother? You're essentially playing a 2-prong strategy where the 2 prongs are much too close together. We get to call. I don't know if we call versus full pot, but we definitely call against min. And we have to peel ace-queen on this board. We might fold a little bit of ace-x, but it would be like ace-6-5-4. And face a half-pot barrel. We go with fold, and I think this is a spot where we want to defend based on equity rather than linearity. So bare ace-queen is probably going to fold at least sometimes. I'd imagine ace-king more or less pure continues. Definitely any set pure continues. Thing is, though, I do have the ace of diamonds, which has some value on certain rivers, and the sizing is another thing where I need to be careful that they're just not continually making small bets and I'm folding a little bit too much of my range each time. This is a board where, like, small blind RFI range has a huge polarity advantage. Well, not huge polarity advantage, but huge sizable equity advantage. And the bluffs that he's choosing probably both have reasonable equity and high follow-through. If not one, then certainly the other. But yeah, it's another of those spots that seem to be coming up a lot, probably because it is a high-stakes tournament against tough opposition, where you need to be careful not to autopilot and defend appropriately, or you can easily just end up overfolding if you restrict yourself to kind of the continues that feel comfortable. So, cleaner pots cutoff, and this is actually a pretty tricky situation. Naturally, I incline towards call, but you don't do much calling with tri-suited hands, even ones as strong as this. Like, this hand is definitely going to VPip. The decision has been calling and 3-betting. And there are a couple of factors in-game that I think decrease the EV of the call option. The first is that cleaner chose the largest possible raise size, and obviously the EV of call, like, you tend to do more calling versus min raises than full pot open. So my call frequency is going to be at its lowest when cleaner picks this particular sizing. The other factor is that both blinds are sub 20 big blind stacks. So if I call, then they should be squeezing a ton. And versus their squeeze, cleaner should be ISOing quite a bit. And then they just get 3.5 big blinds of my money dead in the pot, which obviously I'm kind of disinclined to provide. So in this preflop sim, which is 50 big blinds, so roughly the correct stack size, but a different open size, we can see that this hand class, ace king with another Broadway and a tri-suit, is mainly calling. But as I said, I think in reality, or not in reality, but in the precise situation I faced, the EV of 3-betting is going to be higher. And my particular combination, by the looks of things, is kind of mixing anyway. So I would just convert this to a pure 3-bet. The trend seems to be that you 3-bet the more coordinated combinations, the ones that have additional open-enders. So the Jack-9 3-bets, because, it can flop a bunch of reasonable straight draws. The 10-8 often 3-bet, same kind of thing. And then the combinations that are calling as like, Queen-5, for example, is doing more calling, or Queen-7 with a redundant or less useful dangler. So we go with call, which is not exactly wrong, but I feel like 3-bet would have worked out better for us. But we fade getting squeezed. So we go 3-way to the flop. Flop the nuts, checks to us. And so the interesting thing about this decision is that my natural bet size is going to be around half pot, or potentially just under. And half pot in this situation is kind of an interesting number because it also represents the maximum I can bet whilst keeping the action open if liner shoves and cleaner calls. So the question then becomes, do I want to bet slightly above 22k, slightly below 22k? Essentially, do I want to retain the option to 3-bet all in? There are pros and cons to both. Like, if I retain the option to 3-bet all in, then cleaner has to fold more stuff, including some hands with equity. But if I retain the option to 3-bet all in and don't, then he can draw some inferences from that may potentially enable him to make higher quality decisions on future streets. On balance, I think I'd rather not limit my own, intentionally limit my own options, and cleaner making certain inferences about my range is something that I can guard against by attempting to have a modicum of balance in the hands that end up in situations where he has money left to bet on turn. And in any event, it's a comparatively rare scenario for action to go, I bet liner shoves and cleaner flats. So I don't think it's something we need to be unduly concerned about. And I should pretty much just pick my normal bet size, which would be anything around third to half pot, I think is fine. We go with half pot, which is hard to fold. I have a combination of Jack-9 that's pretty good at getting paid off, and also unblocking all the flush draws. I benefit from picking a sizing that maybe chases a few of those out. From cleaner's perspective, obviously I doubt Linus is holding any flush draw. They both fold, so kind of uneventful hand, but I did think that it represented a couple of interesting talking points that you need to bear in mind when you're playing in tournaments with stack size distributions and variables in scenarios that you're just not going to encounter in cash game environments. Next up, pretty standard open. Linus is on a pretty short stack in the small blind. Some people may recall how we closed out part 4 with a discussion of when to size up as the in-position pre-flop raiser when you're against a short stack in the big blind. Same concepts don't really carry over to the small blind because the small blind is just going to do a lot less V-pipping. And so their stack size carries less weight in your overall kind of pre-flop decision-making. So if Ravens wouldn't Linus switch stacks, then I should be upping my open sizing. But with things as they are, just standard like 2.5-ish or just under seems fine. Get peeled, and we can maybe see bet this flop. Like, you can make arguments for it. I think you need a higher heart to feel particularly confident, or even a card like the Ace of Clubs. This combination, I think, is fine to check back. We have some semi-decent overcard outs, as well as obviously a potential gut shot. Check seems fine. Turns kind of interesting. Again, we have a reasonable kind of like a non-zero EV in the check line. We can river some good pairs, we can river a straight, and so on and so forth. And we don't really have any good removal to anything that Ravens was likely to continue with. And it's also certainly possible that on this board he can check like weak jacks and never fold them and stuff like that. So those are all things that you have to bear in mind that should restrain you a little bit. But I think this is going to be the kind of thing where, yes, we mostly want to bluff, turn interaction like clubs or combinations with other, with more robust equity. But this hand, like, if he does check call a jack, then this hand actually has a decent amount of equity. And also, it's not the worst potential two-barrel candidate, precisely because it has so much positive removal against his flopped and turned draws. So it's going to be the kind of thing where we mostly want, the turn flush draws and stuff like that as our bluffs. But we want a little bit of these hands because the turn flush draws don't make fantastic river bluffs. And so we need a sliver of hands like this in our turn probing range, or turn delay c-betting range rather, so that we can have more effective river bluffs, because then he just has a ton of turn flush draws when we have this combination and action goes check call and the river is, whatever, the 7 of diamonds. Then he has a load of turn flush draws that he's somewhat unlikely to be heroing river with, or at least, make viable check folds at a reasonably high frequency. Again, a higher heart would be nice, some kind of like a better hand would be nice, put bluntly, but you can't have everything. And I think this hand is would make a viable choice as a delay c-bet, and then sometimes follow through on certain rivers. We go with check, which you can also make arguments for. Like, both plays are fine. I think delay c-bet is a reasonable choice, but yeah, we do have EV in the check line and so on and so forth. River enough of a hand to just take a showdown, and it turns out we had pretty similar hands. Obviously, 3-betting here. Flop the nut flush with SPR around about just under 1. I took a look at the equilibrium here for the out of position 3-bet against kind of a short stack cutoff range that we can expect to be a little bit tighter and kind of high card heavy than it may be at deeper stacks. And it seems in places to be pretty dissimilar from certain real-world tendencies, especially where the in-position player is concerned. So we're going to go through it and try and figure out what seems solid and we can look to apply, and what we should probably be trying to deviate from. I think what's throwing these strategies a little bit off in places from what I'd expect to see played in the real world is that the monotone texture and the rank of the cards both polarize in and out of position to auto get-ins and super marginal combinations. aren't many of the top pair plus straight draw kind of combinations for either of us on this board, and neither of us have enough of the auto get-ins to only be v-pipping with those as either the better or the cooler. But as the cooler, it presents particular difficulties. And the solver's kind of fine with that. Like, if we go b33 out of position, which seems to be our preferred sizing, and we just give in position worse than queens, which is roughly half their range, they're still finding quite a few defends with this region. And that includes hands that I'm relatively confident don't get near most people's real-world ranges. King Jack 10-3, no spade, springs immediately to mind, or 10-8-7-6 with a spade, even 10-9-8-8 with a spade, like that kind of thing. And that creates the first kind of exploitative opportunity, in my opinion, which is that we as out of position should likely be doing more betting than the solver thinks we should. We're not doing very much at all, actually, despite having a relatively significant advantage in kind of nutted combinations. We have the nut flush 15% of the time. He has it going on for half as often. Our range obviously also has more equity because we have the best overpairs and he doesn't, so on and so forth. But we're playing a pretty passive strategy. And part of that is because the in-position player is finding an effective defense. I think the in-position player is going to miss a few defends that the solver thinks it should be making. And therefore, we as out of position should probably be looking to do some amount more betting. Because out of position doesn't do much betting with almost any part of their range. When we have stuff like flushes, we're doing a lot of checking, because when we have a flush, we're going to crush the board pretty hard, precisely because in position isn't going to have, very many combinations of stuff like 4-3. We ourselves lack, the 4-3 kind of combinations that want to bet to fold out equity, or a lot of the draws that exist on other textures that can bet as a kind of semi-bluff. When we have kind of our air region, just unpaired spadeless combinations, these are mostly giving up. Because in position is going to find an effective response strategy. We can maybe squeeze in a few of these, a few more of these bluffs, but that's a little bit more dubious, because a lot of the combinations that make total air on this board, we're going to have bad removal against in position's total air, and so in position is going to have something that can continue a little bit more frequently. A hand class that does the most betting is worse than aces, but with a spade, and that does even more as we take down the extent of the showdown value. So, like, worse than pocket tens is now betting nearly half the time. Worse than a deuce, around about the same. So, kind of bluffs, but with a useful blocker is the hand class we get most aggressive with on this board, and these combinations can probably just pure c-bet. As an exploit versus imposition's high probability to miss all of those defends we were talking about earlier, the King Jack 10 douche, the Jack 9-9-8 with the 9 of spades, like that type of thing. When we have the nut flush, or actually just any flush, mostly checking, the combinations that seem to bet the most, and this is something I think we can reasonably apply, seem to be the mid-card flushes. Jack 10-9-8 with spades, we're pretty much always betting, or if we tweak it a little bit, and have like 10-9-8-7 with spades, always betting. I think what's going on there is that we're unblocking in positions continues with, because at equilibrium, if we bet, then in position, if he has the ace of spades, he just always calls. King of spades pretty much always calls. Any pair pretty much always calls. And so we unblock their continues when we have a hand like Jack 10-9-8 that happens to have a flush, because then it's more likely that they have, fours or threes or high spades in their hand. And that seems fine to continue with. Actually, it seems like it might even be slightly better in the real world, because at equilibrium, when in position has a hand like the ace of spades, he's just pure calling, like even an unpaired combination. Whereas in reality, I think some of these hands might occasionally get shoved. It's kind of a free roll, because they're never getting shoved at equilibrium. So even if like two of these combinations find their way over to all in, it increases the EV of betting the combinations we were talking about. As far as nut flushes go, as OOP, Not betting very often, and again, betting more when we have the mid cards for the removal effects we were talking about earlier. So far it seems like my combination should be doing a lot of betting, but unfortunately there's a sting in the tail, and when we have ace-ace specifically, we start doing a whole bunch of checking again. Like if we have any flush, that's our bet frequency. If I say we have ace-ace, it dwindles down significantly. And what's going on there, I'm pretty sure, is that we just block too much. Like, we block him having ace-5, we block him having ace-4, ace-3, ace-2, all of which are continuing. And so we typically play these hands passively in order to induce value, to generate value in other ways, pretty much by inducing stabs. I'm not sure imposition bets at this frequency, but he potentially bets a little bit bigger when he does, even if it's only like kind of like this sizing becomes this sizing. So imposition probably puts about this much money in the pot, except he just does it at a little bit of a lower frequency. And that can suggest some potential adjustments as well. Like, we can check some hands that suffer versus aggression, because we can assume that we'll face aggression at a slightly lower frequency. But yeah, in general, I think we should be doing quite a bit more small, or some amount at least, more small betting here than the solver thinks we should be. In game, we go with small bet, which was almost correct, but turns out the ace-ace, the blocker effects of the second ace are just too bad. Do happen to get called though. And on the turn, I think this now becomes a little bit more straightforward. Like the ace-8, the nut flush combinations we're going to want to check are the ones that block his 2-street cooldowns, and this one really doesn't. Like the SPR is now 0.5, and his range has gotten a little bit stronger, and I don't know that he bluffs all that much versus check and all these kinds of things. So I think we're broadly not interfering that much with his 2-street cooldowns. I think he just has to stack off a bunch of stuff with this low in SPR. And also, 3-bet out of position, C-bet monotone, check turn, blast river doesn't seem like it's likely to be perceived as the most bluff-heavy line in history. That has a little bit less merit when you're playing against someone who I believe to be quite technically minded. But, it could still be a little bit of a thing. So we go ahead and shove. And I think this is basically fine. Get called, and beat a hand that had a little bit of equity, but didn't manage to hit. New table, brief rundown of everyone at it. Sira, don't see him much around, used to be a mid-stakes reg, think he's maybe moved on to other things, again, could just be playing live or whatever. Decently solid, but yeah, I don't see him around all that much, so I can't really say. Lakomi's a little on the erratic side. Smallish sample, though, I don't see him around a whole bunch. Terra is someone I always seem to see at the big PLO events, especially the live ones, like in the World Series. I seem to be at his table every time. Very good solid player. Oddsen is, I think, in semi-retirement nowadays, but in his heyday was one of the best PLO players around, and I'm sure can still hold his own. I Read Books is a name that I feel like I should have an opinion on, but don't. Like, I recognize the name, but I don't have any opinions or reads attached to it for whatever reason, so I'm going to go as kind of a blank slate there. Folds around to Oddsen, who pots button of 30 big blinds. I think this is actually pretty close. I don't know if I meant to 3-bet this hand, so I'm going to check. I'm going to do a quick checkup. So this is my 25 big blind sim, which also includes limping, so he ends up raising a 25% range. Worth bearing in mind that the actual range is probably going to be wider. We just have king, queen, queen with a single suit. So the king, queen, queen with the lowest cards looks to be mostly calling. Yeah, this seems kind of close. Like, it depends a lot on how wide Oddsen's opening button. If Oddsen starts to be opening button with like, let's say 100 big blind frequency off a 30 big blind stack, then my hand just gets to be a 3-bet pretty clearly. Worth noting in the sim that the EV of 3-betting is probably a little bit lower than it will be in this hand, again, because a factor of the preflop raise sizing. I can pure more profitably with a ton of stuff, and I can get less chips in preflop with a 3-bet. I think with a king high suit, I slightly prefer 3-betting. There are some combinations of queens I can call, but with an additional overcard, like, this just means that I run into a higher pair a little bit less often. And the king queen of diamonds combination is, pretty connected and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think 3-bet's pretty decent. And on the flop, it's hard to go too wrong flopping the nuts with SPR of less than 1. Yeah, like, I probably want bets and checks here. Having reviewed the hand, or skimmed the hand quickly already, I went with check, which I don't hate. I would assume my argument was that I blocked 2 queens, which removes combinations not only of queen 8, but of like queen jack, queen 10. Worth noting that I don't block a particularly relevant spade. Like, if I had queens with the queen of spades, I think I like checking a little bit more. He'll have fewer hands to stack off with. When I have the 4 of spades, it's like, well, he doesn't have the 4 of spades that often, so it's marginally less relevant, although certainly I'd prefer the 4 of spades in my hand than the 4 of diamonds. Yeah, I think on this board he just has so much 1 pair plus open end or 1 pair plus gut shot, and the texture isn't one where he starts bluffing a ton of like deuce, deuce, 4, 4. So I think I should probably just shove and make my checks complete board crushers like king, queen, queen, jack with spades, like that kind of thing. But in the hand we go with check. He shoves, we get it in, and hold up against a hand that we could even have been slightly behind that hand on the flop. Pretty clear flat, I think. It would be close if Lacomi had opened with a tighter range, at least in theory. But versus sub 2.5x from the cutoff, I think we get in there with this hand. It is worth noting that Syria is going to squeeze the big blind quite a bit. But that's somewhat mitigated by the fact that if we go 3-way, like, his ability to do very much against, like, to leverage positional advantage against us is limited. And he can actually do things that we benefit from. Like, we call, he calls, it's like 30k in the pot, and he shoves flop, and Terra folds a little bit of stuff that he would have wanted to continue with. But can't because I'm still left 2 out behind, and so like he under realizes his equity, and that is the benefit of that is divided between Ciro and I. So I think call is pretty fair. Ciro goes with squeeze, and I think we now just fold. We're in a lot of trouble against his value region, and his squeezing range should be very linear in this situation. So he has a lot of just like kings or whatever else that we're not doing too well against. If we had a double-suited hand, we pretty much always get it in. If we had a single-suited hand, it's maybe close, but with a tri-suit, fold seems fine. Three bet by Terra, and we have the easiest 4-bet in the world. I'm not sure how much trapping with ace-ace combinations we're doing at 50 big blinds. I think a lot less than at 100, but probably still some. But this combination wouldn't be one of them because we're going to trap the combinations that play well post-flop, and ace-ace deuce 3 with a 3-high suit is definitely not a combination that fits that description. So we go with 4-bet. Get peeled. Not wild about having the ace of clubs in our hand. Like, yes, we generate a few more folds, but when we get it in, our equity is a lot less robust with the ace of clubs because there's fewer flush draws he can have. He might shove a few of those, though, so I guess that's a little bit less of a factor. At any rate, with SPR only slightly greater than 0.5, there's not really anything to do but shove and hope to fade the snap. Pretty decent run out for us, and we beat 8-8 deuce deuce. And this is a hand that is worthwhile going over a little because I think there's a pre-flop error here that's worth pointing out so that you don't make similar ones yourselves going forward. And I think what this could be is an example of transplanting ranges from one scenario to another that is materially different enough to affect the correct decision or the shape of the strategy that you're going to want to play. Double-suited double pairs are typically going to get very high aggression from the blinds. But that aggression maxes out at 100 big blinds, where there are a few things going on. Firstly, they lose less versus 4-bet. Secondly, it's a way in which the out-of-position player ensures that they have the ability to have high equity hands on boards that are otherwise very unfavorable to their range. And thirdly, they are a response to the in-position player often opening wider than at shallower stack sizes, expecting to be able to make up the difference kind of thing in pre-flop equity in post-flop equity over realization as a product of positional advantage. So when I open 50 big blinds effective with basically everyone at the table, or even slightly less in a couple of cases, my range should be pretty snug. And if we do a side-by-side comparison of small blind versus MP at 50 on the left and 100 on the right, we can see a lot more 3-betting going on the right-hand side with the double-suited double pair hand class. Now, these sims are different. The raise size is different, which is going to decrease the EV of calling over on the right and increase it on the left. But I don't think that's the only factor at play here. I don't think that accounts for this large of a difference. And if we run it forward from another position, for example, so now we're 3-betting half of them versus button on the left-hand side against nearly all of them against button on the right. So this is just a hand class that we typically get huge aggression with at 100 big blinds, but significantly less at shallower stack sizes, because firstly, the EV of flopping a set or a straight on a board that's low EV for the out-of-position 3-better's range is more heavily capped. Like, you can't gain as much when there aren't as many chips to win. Secondly, the in-position player is typically opened a tighter range, so you'll get 4-bet more, especially when you don't block their 4-bets. And the EV of calling a 4-bet is lower because you have less in the way of implied odds. But thirdly, you just tend to have an even more linear shape to your strategy when you're the out-of-position player at shallower stack sizes. So the hand classes you're going to be doing more 3-betting with are, the Ace-King XX, or even slightly weaker versions like mediocre high-card hands, basically, are going to get a lot more aggression at shallower stack sizes because the stack-off threshold, stack-off requirements are relaxed. So, for example, if by contrast we do just Ace-King no pair, that gets 32% 3-bet on the left against 25% 3-bet on the right. So this is a hand class that we're playing more aggressively. And obviously, since Ace-King no pair is just like a larger hand class because it's more narrowly defined than the double-suited double pair hand class, we can easily make up for this. For not 3-betting as much with this narrow hand class by 3-betting a little bit more with a much wider one that's better suited to the scenario anyway. Now, in any event, the 8-8 deuce-deuce and the 9-9-3-3 and the most disconnected of all of these combinations aren't doing any 3-betting, even at 100 big blinds, and even against button. But this is definitely not a hand that belongs in your 3-betting range in a 50 big blind tournament scenario against an inline opener from early position. And I only mention it firstly for educational purposes, but secondly in case it seems like I'm kind of hammering on the guy because it's the first error I've ever seen Terra make in many instances of playing together. But it happens to work out for us, and we now have a pretty big stack. Standard open. Flop we can bet or check. Slightly lean towards checking back, I think. Again, we can defend on versus probe on quite a few turns. The SPR is still quite high. So, yeah, I don't really see a ton of merit behind betting. Like, betting wouldn't be exactly bad. It wouldn't get absolutely crushed in terms of EV, but it's kind of like the hand before where we just have a kind of a mid-EV option on the table, which is just a check back. Mid-EV option with no volatility. And that seems preferable to making a marginal C-bet with not much in the way of blockers to his either his continues or potentially more pertinently his check-raising range. So check back seems fine. Turn's pretty good. And now we're going to go ahead and bet. The ace-queen is often the best hand. The queen-high flush draw and a gut shot are useful backup if it isn't. We can still get check-raised, but that's just now, like, we'll have to live with that. Standard call. Could maybe lead this flop once in a while, but mostly check without a club. And I think probe is pretty good now. IP shouldn't connect with this turn particularly well when we have like 9-6-5 combination. He can have some flush draws and stuff like that, but our hand makes a reasonable 2-barrel unblocking all of the flush draws. So there are certain runouts like a 10, for example, where we can turn our hand into a bluff and feel okay about it. Mainly targeting some slightly better hands. This is going to be a very clear 3-bet, I think. If King, Queen, Queen was kind of close against someone with only a slightly stronger range, then King, King, Queen is going to be a slam dunk 3-bet, especially with a Queen high, with a King high suit, and especially for like sub 50 big blinds. Yeah, and like if he squeezes and Bolland shoves, now it's a nightmarish spot that we can just avoid. So checks round now. Can't bet any street. And yeah, we lose to a hand that we should have just pressurized pre-flop. Standard open, Heckland defends. I think we're betting quite a bit of this type of hand. So the 5x we'll mostly want to check is the 5x that blocks his continues. And so having a combination like King-King is kind of nice because he's 3-betting all his King-King at this stack size. So if we had a combination like Queen-Queen, for example, well, now we block him having an overpair that he's always defending. Whereas having King-King is kind of like null blockers. And so it doesn't remove anything that he can continue with and typically biases us a little bit more towards aggression. Yeah, I'd imagine we want to check some 5x, but this combination seems fine to mostly or always bet. And no interest in doing anything here. One of the downsides of opening from under the gun is you have so much double-suited stuff that you often have trouble finding like single heart combinations to bluff on turns such as this. Like if I had a heart in my hand to go with my gut shot, I might sometimes want to take a shot at this pot on the turn. Probably not multi-way, maybe heads up. But yeah, as is just super standard check through, and river completes a whole bunch of bluff catches that aren't folding versus 1 bet. Standard defend. Little bit of showdown value and no blockers to anything, so just keep checking. And can't really call. This is just going to be a 3-bet. I think we're an orbit later from King, King, Queen 7, so that was a 3-bet then. This is a 3-bet now. This one we pull the trigger on. Get called. And so my initial reaction on seeing this hand again, obviously I have no idea how I reacted to it in game, but But when I first saw it upon review again, I was kind of confused. It felt like super small bet would struggle to perform too poorly, but other than that, wasn't totally aware of what I should be looking to do. So we're going to take a look at this spot in the solver to wrap this installment up. So it looks like out of position mixes between two pretty small bet sizes. Super small seemed like an attractive option instinctively, because a lot of the hands that want to bet, kind of like mine, like the ace, jack, 8, 7, it feels like I sometimes want to bet hands like that, but they aren't being used as value bets and they aren't being used as bluffs. The main value of betting them lies in preempting a bluff, like cleaning up equity to super weak hands that imposition can fold. Yes, that's nice, but by and large, we mainly just want to stop him from bluffing us. The thing is, though, or the thing is that makes me think super small is even better, like in game than the solver thinks, is a couple example hands I came up with that I was trying to fold out would be stuff like Queen 6-6-5 double suited, which mixes versus the super small bet, and 10-8-8-7, which also mixes but does more calling. And these aren't hands I'm convinced that the Bolin in game has, versus third pot seems to be the iteration, or not the iteration, the inflection point where these hands start folding. So I'm not convinced that Bolin has these hands. I don't necessarily think he raise calls Queen 6-6-5 or 10, maybe 10-8-8-7, not Queen 6-6-5. So he has some amount fewer of the type of hands that I'm trying to fold out, but whilst not really achieving anything other than that. And so the cheaper a price I can pay to target a pretty small area of his range, that's like as cheap a price as possible as that I can pay, that's going to work out best for me, basically. So maybe I want something between these two sizings, like a quarter pot or something, but generally speaking, I think there's a lot of room here to work with very small bet sizes, not only because of the SPR, because like IP from cutoff at 25 big blinds or just above starting stack seems like he should be pretty snug pre-flop. So it seems like he does quite well on this texture, and when he doesn't, it's in quite a polarized way. Like when he doesn't connect with this texture, it's because he has something like a low double pair, which is one of the hands I'm trying to stop him bluffing me with. But and so when we come to look, I mean, we can make a few general points like ace-king, which we have a lot, mainly bets, does more checking when we have stuff like a queen, blocking some continues like ace-king, queen-jack, mainly checks, that kind of thing. Aces, without better than jack-10, is doing a lot of betting, especially when it has the very lowest cards. This is actually quite interesting for anyone who hasn't seen a video I made called The Most Underrated Card in Poker, which was basically extolling the merits of the deuce and other very low cards. If we look at what we're doing with our double pairs, which is representative of what we're doing when we have just like low card combinations. So we have deuce-deuce, we're always betting. 3-3, mainly betting. 4-4, start to mix in more checks. 5-5, always checking. And basically the idea here is that in position can have 7-6-5-4 double suited, but he probably can't have 5-4-3 deuce double suited. And so we generate a few more folds when we have the deuce, because we're out of the way of his like completely bricked rundowns. Whereas when we have like 4-4-5-5 in our hand, then we start to decrease the number of combinations of those bricked rundowns he has, and which in turn decreases the EV of betting, because otherwise he should be kind of all over this flop otherwise. The other point I want to make is that when we have a hand like mine, so we'll just do actually any ace-jack without better than a queen, and then we had an 8, which is not irrelevant because it blocks them straight. This is a hand that seems to be mixing relatively evenly between bet and check. The interesting thing about this hand is that we only ever have it when we're double suited, so that allows us to make some pretty clear comparisons between certain trends. So our check frequency is 42 with this hand overall. If I say we have 2 hearts, we start to bet it a lot more. And the reason we start to bet it a lot more is, and I have the spade-spade combination, which is the equivalent here. The reason we start to bet it more, and I think the reason I naturally gravitated towards the small bet option when I was looking at it, is if we're saying that we're not betting as for value, and we're not betting exactly as a bluff, and we're mainly trying to target quite a small subset of his hands, then we want to pick the combinations that have the lowest EV in the alternative line. And if we have, like the 2 double suited combinations, for example, then versus bet, we just get to call these hands, like basically always, because we have a gut shot, we can turn some 2 pair, we can turn some flush draws, etc., etc. We have to defend quite a lot against, such a small bet size. Whereas if we have the heart-heart combination, now versus this sizing, we always continue, but versus this sizing, we start mixing in some folds, and we have no guarantee, obviously, that our opponent in-game will pick these sizings. He could bet a sizing where we just have to pure fold, because we have 1 fewer backdoor flush draw, and therefore we're less able to continue against sizings around, let's say, somewhere between third and half pot. And so because when we check, if he bets, we lose the pot with these combinations at a higher frequency, sometimes basically always, we're more inclined to take the alternative route and go with bet. So when we have the single backdoor flush draw combination, we get a lot more aggression, and when we have the ace of hearts, we get more aggression still. And the reason here, or the reason for that, is that now we've said not only do we only have 1 backdoor flush draw, but it isn't a nut backdoor flush draw. So we're going to be doing even more folding because our hand is worth even less. And so as our hand becomes worth progressively less and less in the check line, we start to bet it more and more first time out. In-game we go with check, which we now know is a mistake. He checks back, fortunately. Turn, I think there's now not a lot of merit to betting. Again, it's tough to screw up too much by betting, 20k or something. But he should now be pretty polar. And yeah, like he can easily check back some super nutted stuff with this SPR. It seems like we now beat some of the stuff that he's just giving up with. So yeah. Check seems a lot more viable on turn than it was on flop. Check seems the only option now on the river. We check it through, and he ends up with a hand that I'm pretty sure is meant to put money in at some point. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this hand is meant to bet. Like, I don't know what the solver's going to do with it. I would assume the solver at least sometimes bets flop. Queen, Jack, 10... 8, let's say, yeah. Mostly bets flop, and I would imagine those combinations that check back flop are going to be betting turn. Not exactly... first you can get a little bit of value from some elements of my range. And secondly, to avoid a scenario such as this, where I've checked a give up with a little bit of equity against this specific combination, like I can check just ace, 5, 5, for example. And this hand actually is semi-vulnerable against that hand on turn. Not ridiculously so, but, why not clear up some equity for a relatively low price kind of thing? Especially when you have 3 pairs, so if I check call with ace-king, you just have a little bit more equity against my traps as well. Okay, seems like a reasonable stopping point for part 5. Hopefully everyone's enjoying the series so far. As always, questions, comments, feedback, gratefully received in the thread below or elsewhere. And until next time, it's been Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. Take care.